So, welcome back, and it's good to be back doing something like this again in Third Age Reforged, the first of the faction overview series as it is now, and of course it makes sense to return to such things with factions that are completely new since the last time we did this so very long ago at this point. And we start with the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains, the Dwarves of the Northwest, and they wear their fine craftsmanship openly and certainly know how to use it. It perhaps shouldn't be too much of a surprise that ERED LUIN are the last of the Dwarven peoples to take to the field in Third Age Reforged, as while they are a very well-known part of the lore, they didn't really get involved in the Third Age battles as much as their kin did, and indeed in terms of their position in Middle-earth, they are pretty much the safest of all the peoples that are around. None are further from the Black Land of Mordor than they are, after all. But that is a long story indeed, and will have to be told elsewhere. For now, we shall be looking at what they can do on the battlefield, and first of all we'll go through some of their more general strengths and weaknesses, which are very high level. We'll be going into the minutiae when we actually go into the individual units arrayed on the field. As far as their strengths go, though, one thing that should be quite clear as a Dwarven faction is their overall defence, although they do go about this in a slightly different way to their Dwarven brethren. Of course, the armour is most certainly there and is still the primary way in which they mitigate damage. Of course, this is going to be helpful at long range and up close, more useful against certain types of weaponry and foes than others, but it's always going to be to the dwarves' benefit. No one really does this kind of warfare quite as well as they do when you back it up with the level of quality that they have all throughout their roster at all various tiers. They're always going to be solid with regards to that sort of thing, but that's true across all of the Dwarven factions. What sets ERED LUIN apart a little bit more so is the fact that as you do go into their higher tiers, which are always going to be important for a Dwarven force, you start to see dual wielding become a little bit more of a focus, which does mean they sacrifice a little bit of survivability at long range with regards to some of their infantry, mostly their close range damage dealing units, which we'll get onto later. But this does mean that they do have a little bit of extra melee defense as well, and the combination of a high melee defense and a high armor value is the sort of thing that perhaps you would see more so in a force like Imladris. Of course, ERED LUIN do have certain advantages over Imladris, but also certain disadvantages. It's not exactly the same sort of thing, but this is one of the main things that really does stand out about them when you consider what dwarves are usually all about when it comes to really facing down opposition foes in melee. Of course, this is not also completely true. Stuff like spearmen are still shielded, their javelin units are still shielded, but it's just a slight difference in comparison to their dwarven kin, albeit the defence is still king. Better skirmishers than their dwarven counterparts are also something that they have in their favour, and this is mainly due to two tools that they have which their dwarven brethren lack. The first, the most obvious one as well, is the fact that they have access to a higher tier, more heavily armoured archer, whereas their brethren have to make do with a slightly lightly armoured, lower tier archer, and of course in Erebor they have to make do with crossbows, which, both of these two things can do the job, but ERED LUIN are far more comfortable when it comes to having a high tier heavy archer, which is able to trade blows with either very numerous low tier archers or the equivalent heavy archers from other factions, and it means that one of their weaknesses, which we'll get onto in a little bit, is a little bit less of a problem. The other thing that they have is something which, it's not, I can't really call it a Hwatcher anymore, but it's a very similar sort of thing in the Frostling thrower, which again we'll talk about when we actually get onto the field with the dwarves. Scatter artillery is maybe the best way to put it. This is the sort of thing where if you are on the open field, it's not going to do a huge amount of damage to individual units, as we've said several times in the past, but if the enemy army is spread out, it's going to hit several things. They're not going to be able to stay and stand and shoot in the way that they may want, and in conjunction with your armoured archers, as long as you have a solid place to defend, which of course that is a very dwarven way to approach a battle in the first place, you're going to be pretty good at long range, even though you may not have the numbers of some other factions which can engage in this sort of tactic a little bit more freely perhaps, especially if the map is a little bit more wide and open. You do, however, have the ability to do a lot of damage with a lot of projectiles at long range, and that's to say nothing of the repeater unit, which we'll get onto in a moment, albeit a little bit more specialised perhaps. And the final strength I'll mention here is, rarely I think am I going to mention an individual unit as a strength, but here I will. The Stone Giant, a special unit that is completely unique in the sense that it is just a big Juggernaut. It does have very clearly defined weaknesses, as we will go through when we actually talk about the unit in detail on the field, but suffice it to say that its presence in ERED LUIN's roster forces the opposition to consider it. Even if you don't bring it, that can cause a bit of a game of cat and mouse with your opponent before the game has even begun, because if they don't, and you have, it's an incredibly difficult thing to stop, as we've seen in the past. It can be a bit of a waste, of course. It is very expensive. There are units which can counter it very, very well, but your opposition will need to bring those units, and you will be able to prepare for that either with or without the Stone Giant. So even when it's not on the field, it's going to be doing good work for you. That's not to say that ERED LUIN don't have their share of weaknesses as well. Every faction in the game does. And the most obvious one, of course, is dwarves are expensive. Not the most expensive faction in the game, ERED LUIN, but they're far closer to being the most expensive than the cheapest. And this is not too surprising when you consider the level of quality at the high end that the dwarves often tend to rely upon. But again, like I said, this is not terribly surprising. You're going to have smaller armies, you're going to have to rely on your quality, and as a result, dwarves are going to thrive on order more than chaos. Their defensive lines will need to be solid. You will need to keep yourself in lines and keep yourself well organised and drilled, because if you do get overwhelmed, even the thickest of armour can be a problem when you're getting overrun by hordes and hordes of enemies. But if you keep your positioning, the expense is not necessarily a huge problem, but it is going to limit your options a little bit with regards to numbers. Also, pretty much like every other Dwarven force or Dwarven unit in the game, they're not particularly manoeuvrable. Now, they do have access to cavalry. All of the Dwarven factions, whether it's native dwarves or mercenary humans, do have access to some fast movers, so they're not completely flat-footed. These cavalry units are pretty expensive, however, and also not particularly numerous. And also the infantry itself is also relatively slow. And as I've mentioned, the Blue Mountains are probably more at home when it comes to really sticking to a solid position, forcing the enemy to be a little bit more uncomfortable, and then utilising some of their heavy hitters to really turn the screw. But if you do lose the initiative and you're not able to manoeuvre quickly, that can be a bit of an issue for the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains. And just in general across their units as well, they don't really have access to the same level of phalanx units, which does play into the next weakness a little bit as well, as their counterparts, their Dwarven brethren. They do have some, albeit bodyguard tier units. Again, we'll go through that a little bit more in detail when we look at the rosters up close and personal. But all of these things, it does perhaps limited adaptability is the better way to put it now that I'm saying it out loud, just because if things do start to get away from you as ERED LUIN, they can really start getting away from you, as key units are going to be a real pillar around which you build it, and not just the Stone Giant. And that also comes on to the fact that they have fewer options perhaps than their Dwarven brethren. Like I just mentioned, they do have the more limited options when it comes to forming up a phalanx on the front line. They may have better skirmishers, but overall they have a more limited variety of infantry. But again, you can say that that's somewhat made up for by the fact that they have some utterly unique units like the Stone Giant and other units as well, which are a little bit weird and wonderful. They do also have access to some good cavalry, so they have everything they need, but it is certainly a smaller roster, a narrower roster than the other dwarves do have with regards to some of, particularly the high-end, sort of mid-high-end options that they may enjoy. But I guess the best way to demonstrate that is by actually arraying their units on the field and taking a look at them in some greater detail. So it's been a while since we've taken to the grassy plain in this context, and one thing that we don't have the advantage of here with ERED LUIN that we will have with every faction that follows them is we can't really compare and contrast across factions to see what the differences in stats of units actually are, at least not within the context of a single video. So it's the sort of thing which will clarify itself as time goes along, but in this one I'm going to have to try and do the job of doing that manually, as it were. And in all fairness, we can also compare with some individual unit types within the faction itself, but it's all fairly self-explanatory, and indeed in terms of unit type, the numbers will have greater context as we go on, of course, but the overall message behind many of these units is the same. And one thing I will say as well is that roster bloat is the sort of thing which has definitely been reduced in this version of the game, so this is actually fairly typical for a unit roster size that you will see in the game now, maybe slightly smaller than average. There are still a few which would probably pack out the entirety of the amount of units that you can bring to a field, maybe slightly over that in a couple of cases, But for the most part, this is going to be fairly typical. Some factions that were infamous for it in the past have had their units condensed a little bit more efficiently now, which is the reason why we're able to fit more factions in the game ultimately. So that, I think, is definitely a good thing. But without further ado, let's see what ERED LUIN have to offer, and we'll start off with a familiar face. The Dwarven Miners, very simple. You know, they've not really changed ever since they were added into Reforged so very long ago. Or not even Reforged, actually, standard Third Age. That's the vintage of unit that we're dealing with here. Very simple, and in many ways actually run contrary to most of what ERED LUIN have going for them. I've already mentioned the fact that they do have a little bit of a slant towards melee defense, as we will see throughout the rest of their roster, but the Dwarven Miners certainly don't have that. A defensive skill of 3 is pretty lowly. A total defense of 9 as well is also very lowly, especially when you consider what some of the other Dwarven units are going to be rocking up with. But they do have an attack of 7, charge bonus of 12 for a unit that's only costing 450, and the fact that ultimately ERED LUIN maybe lack a little bit more in terms of natural armor-piercing ability and compared to their Dwarven brethren, at least in melee. They've got other options, which we'll go through a little bit later on, but you know, in terms of a cheap unit which can help to really stack your numbers up, which is the purpose of any good militia unit, and the fact that they maybe offset one of the main weaknesses that the faction does have as well, or at least partially has. I wouldn't say that it's a major weakness of the faction overall, because they do have options in that regard. It's just not quite on the level as their Dwarven brothers, but it is what it is. But as we move on, we will come back to the Miners at a later date with another Dwarven faction in the future, of course, but from here on out, utterly unique units to ERED LUIN. And we start off with the Warriors of the Blue Mountains, a simplistic unit indeed, the same cost, and in many ways a far safer pick of a unit that you can bring. Far more typically Dwarven in terms of what they offer, as well as far as a frontline force goes. They're going to be very good at dealing with lowly units, in particular more numerous forces of orcs. If you can keep them organised, then their quality will see them through. They don't have all that much about them which is going to be setting the world alight in terms of unique traits. You can see morale and stamina are the only things that are worth really mentioning here. But you can see that total defense score, 22, is a big step up from the Miners, as you would expect, but it's also a big step up in comparison to some of the equivalent units from an equivalent faction like Erebor, really, and that's mainly down to the fact that their defensive skill is so relatively high. And for a unit that's relatively inexpensive like this as well, that can really help even the odds. It's a very efficient potential pick on the front line. Decent attack as well, as far as this kind of unit goes, as you would expect from a Dwarven frontline force. They're going to be good for their price point. They will start to struggle when you put them up against stuff that's significantly better than them, of course, and that's where their lower numbers can be a bit of a problem compared to some other things, but decent indeed. And moving on, we have a very similar kind of unit in the Defenders of the Blue Mountains, a little bit more expensive, in fact, and a little bit less in terms of manpower, but they do have a few things that help to offset that. The fact that they can make shield wall, like any trained unit of spearmen at this level can, means that you can help to really mass up on the front line. It's good in a defensive siege, of course, for helping to block choke points if you're able to form your lines up, and it does make you just that little bit more resilient. But one thing that perhaps we've seen a little bit less of, although perhaps more lately considering the recent tournament that took place, is their utility on an open field. They can be fantastic on a flanker unit of spears and Dwarven spears with their heightened abilities. You can see the shield value of 10. You can see the defensive skill, which has gone down a little bit now, in terms that it's only got 6, but then spears in general are going to be less potent melee combatants because they're going to have lower damage. They're going to have that spear malice, which affects them. But the anti-cavalry in this sort of context can be important, and it's really just depending on what you want, whether you're going to want to go with more of the melee infantry or more of the spears. Moving on, the rest of the only other unit that's in the more basic infantry tier for the Dwarves of ERED LUIN are the Stone Hewers of the Blue Mountains, which are actually an especially important unit for ERED LUIN because they don't really have anything else in their main line of infantry anyway, which is going to be able to deal damage naturally in an armor-piercing way. They've got plenty of units which can deal plenty of damage, of course, but you know, this is their only real option when it comes to wielding that two-handed axe, which many of the other dwarves, of course, they're going to have access to a unit of a slightly higher tier that can do this job, or even potentially a bodyguard tier unit which has got armor piercing, but we'll get more onto what ERED LUIN are all about in that regard a little bit later on. You can see here big attack values of 16, big charge, and the effectiveness against armor are the important things. A couple of other things that are worth mentioning, however, is the fact that the defensive skill especially when you compare it to the two units that we've just seen, the other basic units, which are maybe a little bit more naturally defensive in nature because they're shielded, a little bit more numerous, of course. It is pretty high for a unit Marksmen, and again, this is partly down to that Dwarven quality that's coming into effect. When we compare it to other basic Axemen from other factions, you're going to see that number go down, of course, but it's also down to the fact that ERED LUIN prize that asset a little bit more so than their Dwarven cousins, as we've already seen. It's the kind of mix that you would maybe expect to see the elves prize, at least certain elves, when it comes to that mix of armour and defensive skill. It can make them a real problem in melee, when even a unit which traditionally is going to have a little bit less staying power in melee can keep themselves alive a little bit more. This is one of the units, however, because it is unshielded, and 650 is starting to creep up a little bit in terms of cost. It's going to be one of those units which enemy archers or enemy missile units of any description really are going to be trying to shoot down as a matter of course. So it's one of the ways in which ERED LUIN, and we'll get onto their skirmishers in a minute, are going to have to try and protect their melee units. Moving on to the upper tier of ERED LUIN infantry, and this is where you really start to see their focuses come into effect. The Wardens of Thorin's Halls. Now 900 is a significant step up in terms of cost. This is where you start to get into what you would consider high tier units really. The only tier beyond this are the bodyguards and, well, something else that we'll get onto in a moment that's looming in the background. Wardens of Thorin's Halls, though, you can see the attack is still pretty good, and the fact that they wield axes are seen as a more aggressive weapon, and generally speaking, if a unit is wielding an axe across the course of Third Age Reforged development, it's a sign that they're going to be a little bit more gifted in terms of their attacking prowess. And that's kind of true here, but of course the main stat that you can see there is their defense. Armor of 12, defensive skill that's equal to that. The other Dwarven factions, you'll see that value is tilted over in favour of the armor score, and that's a little bit more natural to what you would expect, of course. But here, these guys, they're not only master craftsmen, as I mentioned, they are fully able to use their tools with great effectiveness and finesse as well. Shield value as well, they do wear a shield on their back. I mean, it is going to be less effective than having the shield on their front, of course, so they are a little bit more vulnerable to regular projectiles as a result, but the armor score is still high enough, and generally speaking, ERED LUIN can control that kind of battle well enough that it shouldn't be a deal breaker for this kind of unit. And ultimately, you know, their staying power and damage in melee is a real problem. Inspires nearby troops, excellent morale, very good stamina, all the sorts of things that you would want from really your main combatant when it comes to a mass brawl in the middle of a battlefield. Something which is perhaps a little bit more familiar to a Dwarven way of doing battle are the Spear Guard of Thorin's Halls. This isn't the first heavily armoured Dwarven spear unit that we will see when we go on to talk about the other two Dwarven factions in the game, which are a little bit more familiar to the players of Reforged. Spear Guard, though, 750 is not quite as expensive, and this is down to the fact that they are ultimately going to be less effective at dealing damage. They're not terrible at dealing damage by any means. Upper tier Dwarven spears are still going to be able to do a good amount of damage, and part of that is going to be down to their staying power in melee, a huge total defense of 28, a large part of that coming down to their shield value. Going to be very solid on the front line. Any weakness that you may think the Wardens have to arrow fire is certainly not going to be something that the Spear Guard have. They can also make shield wall, good bonus fighting cavalry as well as any unit of spears is going to have. These two are really going to be the heart and soul of any melee fighting force that ERED LUIN put up, and it's a difficult thing to wear down. If you get into a battle of attrition against ERED LUIN, that mix of armour and defence and just all-round finesse really that is maybe a little bit alien to some of the other dwarves, which we may get onto later, that can make a big difference. But the ultimate in that regard is going to be ERED LUIN's dedicated infantry bodyguard, of which there is only one, and that is the Juggernauts, another dual-wielding unit, wielding two dual axes just like the Wardens in front of them, wearing their banners upon their backs as well. Effective against armour, so this is the other unit of armour piercing that ERED LUIN have, though the difference with the stone hewers is that you can't mass the Juggernauts up, of course. You can go into the red limit, but certainly not the sort of thing that you're going to see happen too often, again, because ERED LUIN, they're not the cheapest faction in the world, as I mentioned, like the dwarves. There are certainly more expensive factions, but still, they frighten nearby enemy infantry as well, which the fear and inspiration mechanics do now work in Reforged, so that is worth bearing in mind. If you start to lose against ERED LUIN and these guys are on the front line, they're going to make you lose just that little bit more quickly because your unit's going to start fleeing in the face of them. And you can see that the attack score, the charge bonus, the total defense, all of that sort of thing, hit points of 3, they are a very, very tough unit to wear down purely in melee. very often it can come down to you needing to influence the battle through outside means or have overwhelming force against them, especially when they have the backup of their rank and file in front of them. They are a very effective singular bodyguard unit. It will be interesting to see how they get on in single 1v1 fights against some of the best that other factions have to offer. I don't know whether they still have it as well, but they do have kind of a strange animation, or had a strange animation, where they would be constantly taunting their foes, but we can say that that's what frightens the enemy, I suppose. Speaking of frightening the enemy, we're going to have to go up a little bit here. The Stone Giant. I didn't really know where to put the Stone Giant. Weapon type cannon, melee attack, missile attack, all of that sort of thing. You can see, I think, to be honest with you, the numbers are not really worth looking at with the Stone Giant. Basically, these were the numbers that were necessary to make the Stone Giant function in Medieval 2's mechanics. We've already seen the Stone Giant in the lead up to release, and we've seen how it can be a total waste, and we've also seen how it can be nigh unstoppable. There are a few units which are good at dealing with them. Javelins, and high-tier javelins primarily, are going to be probably the best way of dealing with the Stone Giant, but also really high-end armor-piercing units, because, I mean, if you look at the armor of 50, you look at the hit points of 15, the shield value of 30 means that as much as you can hit them with arrows very easily, but it's going to be very, very difficult to do any sort of lasting damage to a boulder ultimately with a simple bow. Also, I'd be interested to see how he gets on when facing a full flush charge from some of the best cavalry in the game. But ultimately, this is what I was talking about when it came to the intro to ERED LUIN. It's, you know that if they're going to bring the Stone Giant, you know what it's capable of, you have to work to counter it. If ERED LUIN chooses to bring the Stone Giant and there are a bunch of counters on the field, it's then down to ERED LUIN to try and pick those apart, play that chess game, and then deploy the Stone Giant as the haymaker at the end. Or, if your opponent has gambled and thought that you haven't brought the Stone Giant, you can use him as the vanguard, the opening piece, and then the rest of the dwarves can follow through. 1500 is a lot of gold to sink into something which is ultimately a bit of a risk, but it's one of those things, kind of like the Witchers from Angmar, where you have to plan for him, otherwise you're leaving yourself wide open for massive, massive trouble, as we've seen. And it'll be interesting to see how he gets on in future battles. And I've kind of classed him as an infantry. He's kind of, you know, again, he does have the missile attack as well, but it's kind of difficult to know where to place this thing. I mean, an individual living artillery piece, but it didn't really feel right to put him alongside the Frostling thrower, to be honest, which we'll get onto a little bit later. But speaking of missile units, we shall now move on, and you can see here that it only really starts at the high tier. They don't have any entry-level skirmishers, and we have mentioned how ERED LUIN are probably the best of the patient skirmishers, so we say, of the dwarves, and it's not because they get the job done cheaply, it's because they get the job done well. Guardians of the Blue Mountains are a little bit more up close and personal, however. This is one of the ways in which they can mitigate the fact that they are a little bit more finesse and defense focused. They can bludgeon their enemy to death as well, should they so choose, and the javelins are one of the ways in which they can do that. Obviously, you know, javelins are going to have that big missile attack, they're going to have that effectiveness against armoured targets as well. And they're decent melee combatants, the Guardians of the Blue Mountains, and they kind of need to be, because the ERED LUIN army is relatively small. It's pretty likely that the Guardians, especially on a more open map, are going to get engaged before they can use their javelins. A little bit easier to protect them in a siege. But they need to be able to defend themselves in melee, potentially fight their way out of an encounter that the opposition has forced, and then you can maybe use the javelins later. It's a difficult game to play when you get into that sort of thing, but they are more of a hybrid unit than not, I would suggest, purely because of their high melee stats and the fact that they will need to get involved in the melee fight at some point, and that may often be sooner rather than later, depending on the level of numbers that ERED LUIN are facing and what sort of geometry the battle is taking place under. Then, the Marksmen of Thorin's Halls, very different to the sort of skirmishing focuses that the other dwarves tend to have. Khazad-dûm do have an archer, but it's not at the same level as these marksmen. Erebor do not. They traffic in crossbows instead, which means that they're not going to win the ranged game. They need to get closer. They need to be the ones to move unless they're defending their own keep. But here we can see, again, good stats. The armour is going to be good. I mean, to be fair, the melee defense of these guys, they're a little bit less suited for frontline combat once they're out of ammunition than the Guardians, but it's also far more likely that if they're getting involved in the battle as they should, they're going to be hanging back, they're going to be doing their damage with their bows, and late game, if they do need to get involved in melee, then they do still have the ability to keep themselves alive, and they can use sharpened stakes, long-range missiles, all of these sorts of things. Just basic ERED LUIN warriors. I mean, I wouldn't class the Thorin's Hall class of units as basic, especially considering that this is one of the waymarkers that shows ERED LUIN mean a little bit more business when playing that long-range game. You need to be very careful, and another unique projectile that they have are these repeaters of theirs. The Frostspears of Aagol, missile attack of 20, effective against armour. They can use sharpened stakes, all of the trimmings of course, but this is another one of those units where you kind of need to see it in action to see what it's all about, because it works differently to many other types of projectiles. It's maybe similar to a crossbow in terms of the fact that it needs a clear line of sight, but it's far quicker. You're going to get a stream of projectiles going into the enemy. It's going to do a lot of damage very, very quickly, but also you need that constant stream. If it's interrupted or you don't have that line of sight, it can be a problem. So on an open field such as the grassy plain that we're on at the moment, it may prove to be a little bit difficult to use the Frost Spears to their absolute maximum, and indeed many times we've seen ERED LUIN take the field. The Frost Spears, even in a siege, whether it's defensive or offensive, you do need to wrangle them a little bit, but if you can get the most out of them, you can get some truly high levels of kills from them. 1,000 is an expensive unit, but then the reward for using them well is, you know, more than paying for that, really. It's not as obviously extreme as the Stone Giant in terms of how they can be a bit of a waste or an utter triumph, but it's going along that sort of route. So maybe a little bit less easy to use than the archers just in front of them, but the reward is higher. And one unit that has been pretty much universally impressive, even when ERED LUIN have had a bit of a hard time, is another one of their bodyguard units, this being a Javelin Halberdier hybrid, the High Thanes of Aagol. I mean, 1400 is expensive, but they are very good in melee, and they've got a lot of things going for them. A bonus fighting cavalry because of those halberds, effectiveness against armour. Let's not forget, of course, that this is the only phalanx unit, really, or well, long weapon unit, I should say, because there's no guarantee that a two-handed spear or halberd unit actually does have the phalanx formation, but the effect is similar still, nonetheless. Very, very powerful. I mean, you've got the melee attack still is 20, the missile attack is good, they've got a good charge bonus as well, interestingly enough, which, considering their weapon type, is not utterly unique. There are other examples of that, but more on that at a later date. But yeah, the combination of really powerful Javelin unit and also difficult to kill unit in melee because of their weapon type, and ultimately all the trimmings that come with dwarves, with armour and the ability to use their equipment as well very, very effectively, makes them a bit of a porcupine of a unit. If you get too close, they're going to hit you with javelins. If you close them too quickly, then they're going to do a lot of damage with their halberds. Not too dissimilar to other similar types of units like the Gatekeepers and the Proudfoots from other factions that we shall be talking about in the future. 2 hit points as well, of course. Any good, especially Dwarven bodyguard, is going to have more than a singular hit point. And they do have some cavalry as well at their disposal, again similar in many ways to their cousins from Erebor. The more basic example being the Warboars of the Blue Mountains. I mean, 1,000 is a lot for a unit which, you know, cavalry, as we've seen in the recent tournament, cavalry, basic cavalry. I'm not sure I'd call this basic because, you know, it is more expensive than many basic units of cavalry from other factions, but the point still stands. The single hit point cavalry in previous versions of the game just wasn't very good. However, the most recent tournament proves that they have definitely mitigated that now, and the Warboars are one such example of that. Bonus fighting cavalry, you can see, based on their weaponry, they don't wield a lance, they do wield an axe and their shield, so they're going to be more of a defensive unit of cavalry, which if you see them on the open field, they're going to be trying to block for their infantry, and considering the smaller size of a dwarven force, you do need to try and prevent any sort of lance cavalry from really hitting your soft, vulnerable underbelly, because if you do, you're going to end up losing a lot of value very, very quickly. So that's going to be the main attraction with picking a unit like this. Good defensive skill, good armour means they're going to be very good at that role as long as they don't come up against anything that's too top of the tree. Again, attack and a decent charge as well. I mean, a charge bonus of 15, considering the kind of unit that it is nothing to be sniffed at. But these units, which I don't know if you'd mechanically you wouldn't, but I mean these more monstrous cavalry units, for lack of a better term, like the Erebor cavalry, Harad had a few options in the past as well, but they always tend to have good charge bonuses even when it's not really their MO. They often fall down in other ways, but again, perfectly serviceable unit of melee cavalry this, which you'd hope so, given the cost. And then something a little bit more unique for the Dwarves perhaps, at least in terms of bodyguard tier cavalry. The Duran's Warborn, very, very expensive, the most expensive unit that the forces of ERED LUIN can bring, even more so than the Stone Giant, which is, you know, it says something really. It does say something about the potential, you know, high heights that cavalry can reach, although all cavalry is going to be more universally useful than perhaps a hard-countered Stone Giant, so that's one way that you could also look at it. Inspiring nearby troops, it also has a bonus at fighting cavalry, albeit you can see with the charge bonus of 20 and the fact that they wield, you wouldn't really call it a lance, but the same principle does apply. This sort of axe with a spike at halberd, again not really, because it's got the axe head on both sides. I'm not sure, honestly, but they're going to lower that as if it were a lance, and they're going to be able to skewer many a foe that comes their way. Hit points of 3 as well. I mean, it's not terribly common to have a unit that has 3 hit points, and ERED LUIN have 2. So very, very potent force indeed if you can get them rolling. They don't really have the cavalry numbers to be a true cavalry powerhouse, but they can certainly be a good foil for the quality that you have on foot and at range. And especially when you're on a more open field like this, it can pay to have a unit that can really hit the enemy where it hurts. And few units are going to hit as hard off the charge as the Duran's Warborn, in all fairness. And then finally, a unit which I did mention earlier in the unit rundown, and another thing which gives them a bit of an edge when it comes to skirmishing with an opposition, the Frostling thrower. You can see what kind of artillery piece it is. It's one of these multi-shot, multi-target kind of artillery pieces. You're not really going to be hitting any individual target with any great accuracy, and certainly not going to be doing damage quickly to singular targets, but you're going to be doing good damage across the spread of an entire army. And yeah, the projectiles are similar to, of course, the repeaters that we've already seen in the skirmishers, the Frostbeers of Aagol, more of sort of a banked version of that, really. And you can see it's also manned by more Wardens of Thorin's halls, and they do have the same sort of stats. In fact, I think it might even be a little bit higher in terms of armour and defensive skill. Missiles can impale several men, so there's also that. It's one of those kind of chaotic bits of artillery, though, where artillery is always a little bit of a gamble in Medieval 2, and when you bring a unit like this, the only way that you can be sure that it's going to get the value that you want it to is if your opponent sits there and doesn't react to the forces that you've got. Your opponent probably is going to react if they see that you've got range domination with this and the other tools that we've mentioned previously. That's kind of what you want as ERED LUIN, though, because it means that you can react accordingly to that. You can use your really heavy hitting stuff like your Stone Giant, your really good quality infantry, potentially your Boars as well, and this is one of the tools that you can use to do that on the open field. As a siege weapon, when you're laying siege to a settlement, it's going to be less impressive, of course, and defending in a siege as well, it can be a little bit difficult to position it appropriately. So this is one of those rarer units perhaps for the Dwarves where it's significantly more at home on the open field than it is when they're defending their settlements and their holds. But then again, we'll see more of it, I'm sure, because we haven't really seen too much of the Frostling thrower. We saw it once in the tournament, I believe, but we haven't really seen it elsewise apart from that, and that might be because that's the only time we've seen ERED LUIN on the open field recently. But yes, that is ERED LUIN's roster. Again, not exhaustive in the way that it has been in the past, but you can see that they do have a lot of good options. They have that quality, and if the battle goes their way and they are about control, like I said, they like order, they thrive on it. If things get a little bit more chaotic and they start to lose some important pillars, like, you know, their bodyguard units, the Stone Giant, artillery, stuff like that, that can be important to help tie the army together, because ultimately they are going to thrive on those singular points of reference, especially on an open field, I would suggest. In a siege where the variables are more controllable by everyone involved, that's when they will fall back more on their general quality, I think, but that's not an area where the Dwarves tend to suffer anyway. So yeah, that is the ERED LUIN roster. And there we have it. It's been a while since I've done that. It feels a little bit weird to be doing it again, actually. The last time that I did that, I was living in a completely different place, but we return, and the next faction overview that we do, of course, these are going to become a regular thing as well, and I'm not just going to be doing the completely new factions, although that is where we're going to be starting. We are going to go through all of them in turn, because there have been some significant changes to all of them. Like I said, there's been a lot of trimming of the rosters to prevent roster bloat, and there's been a lot of changing around in general with how the game works, and it will help to build up a bigger picture across the whole piece as well of how these factions differ from one another. It's all well and good me saying that these ERED LUIN values in terms of their melee defense were high in comparison to even some of the high quality factions in the game, but it's another thing to see all of that. And speaking of which, the next faction overview that we will be doing is the other completely new faction that was released as a part of 0.98, the Rovanian. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.